Season 3 is in full swing, and we've seen everything from the rise of Frost DKs to the complete shutdown of a Ret Paladin Discord channel. And with the race to world first being well over at this point, Blizzard has continued to tune the knobs on class balance in 11.2. That's why we decided it was time to hit up our consulting team from Echo and Method to get an update on the meta. And using these same players, we've rolled out brand new updates for all of our Mythic Plus courses at skillcap.com. There, you will learn a ton of min-maxing tips in one convenient place, organized into bite-sized videos that teach you rank 1 level knowledge fast. We've even leveled up the Skill Cap add-on for Season 3, giving you a fully configured UI with just one click, including custom nameplate profiles, weak auras, and hitting settings tweaks to give you everything you would ever need to climb. Everything we offer is backed up by a rank-up guarantee, where we promise to deliver results while using our service, or you get your money back. A single subscription covers all of our games, so if you're ready to start your journey today, be sure to use the exclusive discount link below to get started. For now, let's get back to the tier list. This might seem like a weird place to start, but let's talk about the healer meta first. Looking at the leaderboards, you will notice a trend. There's a lot of blue and orange in the healer column, with Shaman and Druid being the obvious standouts so far this season. Having great utility, phenomenal stops, and some of the best raid buffs in the game is one thing, but having that in the toolkit of a healer feels exceptionally strong. So it's no wonder that both of these healers are doing well in Season 3. Resto Shamans are extremely high value right now, not only having a bunch of stops, but really great active damage and one of the best raid buffs in the game with Sky Fury, which is a massive DPS buff to many DPS, especially Frost Death Knight. And although their spot healing can still be an issue, Resto Shamans compensate by having a ton of healing cooldowns. While Shamans have definitely dominated the early season so far, we're starting to see more Resto Druids climb to the top of the leaderboards. As always, Druids will always be high value in Mythic Plus thanks to Mark of the Wild, and are doing an incredible amount of healing this season without compromising too much on damage. In any case, Resto Druids always seem to scale well with time over the course of an expansion, and it's no wonder we're seeing them pop up in Season 3. So if you're wanting the absolute best healers for the highest keys, you can't really go wrong with either one of these options. Now, if there's one healer we think could be undervalued right now, it's definitely Preservation Evoker. This spec does ridiculous damage, due in part to this season's 4 set, and the fact that Chrono Warden gives Evokers a dose of steroids every pull thanks to Tip the Scales. And speaking of doing big DPS, Voidweaver Disc Priest is up there too, having some great damage and healing during Mindbender windows. Obviously, the main problem with Priest is that you lack an interrupt, and although their AoE healing is pretty good, Disc can struggle with single target spot healing. Unfortunately for all of you Holy Priest fans out there, the spec is arguably the worst healer in Mythic Plus right now, and doesn't offer anything particularly useful in the meta. Up next is Holy Paladin, who in terms of being an actual healer is in a really good position, having really good spot healing and burst AoE healing without being as tied to CDs compared to previous seasons. Holy Paladin is one of those healers who just offer their group a ton of stability. They do have some issues though, as even though Paladins can provide solid AoE damage, right now their single target damage isn't that great. All that's left is Mistweaver Monk, who are obviously really great at the start of last season thanks to having some insane damage output, but after taking a few nerfs over the course of the expansion, Mistweaver isn't in the best of shape. Obviously, the advantage of bringing a Monk is that they tend to do well in physical comps, while having decent stops and good passive damage, but right now, they're just surpassed by Preservation Evokers and Disc Priests in the meta. Anyway, that brings us to our complete picture of the healer meta in Season 3, with Druid and Shaman being at the top, with a variety of off-meta alternatives in the A tier. Now though, let's take a look at what's happening in the melee meta for Season 3. If there's one spec that's really standing out right now, it's definitely Frost Death Knight, who enormously benefited from their rework going to the 11.2 patch. With the buffs to Deathbringer and with reworks to Breath of Sindragosa and Frost Scythe, Frost DKs are doing an absurd amount of AoE and priority damage. And while DKs don't bring an official raid buff, they compensate with their utility and unrivaled tankiness, and we fully expect Frost DK to be in the lineup of many MDI comps later next month. The only other melee which is clearly standing out right now is Havoc Demon Hunter, who have really good funnel damage with Eldrachi Reaver thanks to Wounded Quarry. DH obviously brings one of the best debuffs in the game thanks to Chaos Brand, which was of course nerfed earlier this expansion, but is still super high value given the prevalence of magic damage in this day and age. Demon Hunter is also relatively tanky, especially against rot damage, and as one of the specs with a healing reduction effect, it does gain some niche value, especially against the mini-boss towards the end of Halls of Atonement. Both Frost DK and Havoc Demon Hunter will be landing on the S tier. Moving down to the A tier, we have Ret Paladin, a spec which is so polarizing that it shut down an entire Discord channel earlier this patch. It's pretty common for players to overlook stability when it comes to Mythic Plus. While Ret Paladin isn't necessarily the best spec to have for the highest keys, it's definitely a staple for any pugs thanks to their wide array of utility and incredible durability. And speaking of being tanky, we have two of our rogue specs landing somewhere in the A tier, with Subtlety and Outlaw both offering dramatically different flavors of melee DPS. Subtlety is definitely the more bursty of the two, having some ridiculous damage peaks every 90 seconds thanks to Shadow Blades and Flagellation, doing great priority damage, while also dealing good AoE thanks to Unseen Blade on the Trickster hero tree. On the other hand, Outlaw's damage profile is much more flat, having a significantly longer cooldown window, assuming you don't die, of course. In many ways, Outlaw Rogue is basically a Fury Warrior in disguise, but with a different target cap. And speaking of Fury Warrior, it's also a high tier option this season, but still performs best in melee comps with Brewmaster Monks when pushing the highest keys. These two specs have passive synergy in terms of pull size, where both BM Monks and Fury Warriors benefit from smaller, more controlled pulls rather than relying on massive AoE. We're also going to put Unholy DK on the high tiers too. Even though Frost seemed to benefit more from their rework, there's still a lot of potential for this spec as it does bring great uncapped AoE damage. If Frost winds up falling out of the meta, we could easily see Unholy become a strict 1-to-1 replacement in high keys. The only other melee that really stands out is Feral Druid, which, as a reminder, got some fairly substantial buffs going into the 11.2 patch. Feral Druid has some pretty solid funnel and AoE damage thanks to the combination of Rampant Ferocity and AoE rips, and although it's not as passively tanky as some of the high tier melee, Feral is still very rewarding for smart defensive play, otherwise known as shifting into bear form. And at this point, we have a complete picture of the high tier melee for Mythic Plus, with many of the A tiers being extremely strong in the right comps. Beyond this, we start seeing specs fall victim to some structural issues. While Assassination Rogue is arguably the best funnel damage on paper thanks to Singular Focus, it is still one of those specs the entire group needs to play around, even adjusting their entire route to allow for those much needed re-stealths so that the Rogue can consistently ramp their damage. In the right context, Assa is A+ tier, but for pugs, it might seem weak. Enhancement Shaman also has some issues, one being that both Resto and Elemental are so insanely good this season, which can make it harder to slot this mid-tier melee into some groups. Right now, Enhance is super reliant on making the most out of Ascendance procs and Tempest, essentially turning it into a slot machine spec, and leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to single target damage. Rounding out the mid-tiers is Arms Warrior, which is basically the 1-to-1 replacement for Fury in any dungeon with bigger pull sizes. Other than doing better AoE damage, there's no real benefit to bringing an Arms Warrior into your group. And at this point, we have made our way through the mid-tiers with only 2 specs remaining. Unfortunately, Windwalker Monk is one of them. While monks do provide good utility while being relatively tanky, the damage numbers just aren't there this season. That leaves Survival Hunter as our last spec. Right now, both Marks and BM doing significantly better damage, with Survival having the obvious downside that it is a melee spec. But with every melee covered, let's take a look at the ranged meta going into the middle of Season 3. Right now, Arcane Mage is definitely a standout. The Mage class as a whole always seems to have a place in the high tiers of Mythic Plus, given the fact that they are practically immortal when played well, and have some of the best stops and defensive utility in the game with Mass Barrier. This season, Arcane is just the standout spec, having absolutely insane priority damage and shining in pulls with 4 to 5 targets, which offers perfect synergy with the next S-tier DPS, Marks Hunters. Even though Hunters don't really bring a true raid buff, both Marks and BM are doing exceptionally well this season in different contexts. In dungeons with smaller pull sizes, Dark Ranger Marks is doing really well on damage thanks to Phantom Pain. And we're even starting to see BM Hunters swap over from Pack Leader too, thanks to the added defensive perk of Smokescreen. These 2 specs are S tier within specific contexts. If the run involves smaller packs, Marks can do well, but since many BM Hunters are now playing Dark Ranger, Beast Mastery might have the overall lead in the meta, with the flexibility to shine on AoE and prio damage depending on hero spec. The only other ranged DPS that really stands out right now is Elemental Shaman, who is doing some ridiculous damage as Stormbringer right now, all while having some of the absolute best utility in the game. There's only 2 downsides to Ellie right now. The first being that their single target damage isn't that great, and the second being that their survivability still isn't the best. In any case, these are the specs which have been the most impressive so far this season and are proven to work in the highest keys. Then moving into the A tier, we have Balanced Druid, which is still very competitive despite seeing much better days. Of course, Boomkins have a lot to offer with their base toolkit, including the MVP raid buff, great utility, and a bunch of stops, but leave a lot to be desired when it comes to damage. Another problem this season is dungeon design and routing of all things, where the value of Solar Beam just isn't there compared to previous seasons. Up next, we have Destro Warlock, which is quite a polarizing spec. On one hand, Hellcaller Destro has the best uncapped AoE in the game and scales exponentially with pull sizes. In any dungeon with smaller pull sizes, however, Diabolist starts to take the lead. And this is also the preferred hero spec for demo at the moment, which in many ways is a rather neutral spec in the sense that it doesn't really care about pull sizes and is less reliant on cooldowns. All you do is blast. Of course, the Warlock class as a whole has good passive survivability, which altogether make Demo and Destro solid A tier picks. And if you're wondering about Affliction, this spec is structurally worse than the other two. While Hellcaller Athlete can put out some crazy numbers, it's significantly more cooldown dependent. We're also going to place Frost and Fire Mage in the mid to high tiers. It's always hard to gauge these off-meta specs of a pure DPS class since people tend to gravitate towards whatever is the most OP. There's always going to be a place for Mage and Mythic Plus given all the strength of their base toolkit, but in terms of numbers, neither Frost nor Fire can compete with Arcane. Anyway, rounding out the A tier, we have Shadow Priest, which might seem like a hot take, but this spec has a ton of potential with the right skill set. Shadow offers some niche utility, but is more or less a passenger in every group. Its role is to pump damage and provide PI, and that's pretty much it. The spec does require a bit of ramp and has a steeper learning curve when it comes to extending cooldown windows, so it might not be the best in lower key levels. Anyway, if you're looking for a high tier range DPS to play this season, there are quite a few viable options. Every other caster will land somewhere in the B tier, starting with Devastation. There's a general rule you should know by now: if you don't bring a crazy raid buff, you better be doing ungodly damage, like those hunters. And while Devastation can do great AoE damage, it doesn't have the best single target, which essentially turns the spec into a budget version of Ellie Shaman. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much data on augmentation so far this season, but it has a solid base kit, so the B tier seems appropriate. Anyway, that brings us to our complete picture of the range DPS meta in Season 3, with Arcane Mage, Hunter, and Elemental Shaman all being staples in the highest keys. But now let's wrap things up by taking a look at the state of tanks. At the very top of the meta, there are two very different flavors of dominant tanks. On one hand, we have Prot Warrior, who lucked out on the tier set lottery and are doing some insane AoE damage output as Mountain Thane while being super tanky this season. As always, Prot Warriors have great utility and synergize well with any physical comp. On the other hand, Prot Paladins continue to offer stability to high keys. While it is not the tankiest tank and doesn't have the best overall damage, this spec is a Swiss Army knife of cooldowns and utility, while having the ability to solo kick better than any other tank, which altogether make Prot Paladin a safety pick for pugs. Without a doubt, these are the absolute best tanks in the meta so far in Season 3. Right below them, we have some more situationally useful options, starting with Vengeance Demon Hunter, who are still pretty bulky and synergize well with caster comps. Just like Havoc, Vengeance also excels with funnel damage while having really good control. If the meta ever shifts back to fully ranged groups, we could see Vengeance becoming a staple once again in high keys. Joining DH on the A tier is Brewmaster Monk, who admittedly has a bit of a learning curve and is one of the more challenging tanks to play, but definitely has its niche in melee comps. As we mentioned earlier, there are some DPS who benefit from smaller pull sizes, which is where BM Monk excels. The only caveat for this tank is that it does require a bit more babysitting from healers, but pairing with Resto Druid tends to solve this issue. Anyway, these are the options for high tier tanks so far this season. Dropping down into the mid-tier, we have our last two specs with Guardian Druid and Blood DK. While there are some people who are definitely making these specs work in high keys, comp selection is a big issue considering that both Resto Druid and Frost DK are insanely strong this season. With that said, Blood DKs are capable of doing some insane damage, especially during Dancing Rune Weapon, and if your goal is to give your healer a heart attack, then this might be the spec for you. Anyway, if you were wanting a snapshot of the tanking meta in Season 3, then any tank that starts with the word protection is a foolproof choice. And be sure to check out skillcap.com, where we've rolled out some brand new courses for Season 3. We worked with MDI players like Stove from Mandatory to create the largest collection of guides for Mythic Plus. These include courses which teach you the fundamentals and advanced mechanics you need to know to master your class. We even have dungeon walkthroughs that teach you some of the hidden tricks that you can easily use in your next run to rank up before the season ends. And with brand new update to the skill capped add-on, you can get a rank 1 level UI with the click of a button with fully customized nameplates, weak auras, and more. All this and more is why we offer a rating gain guarantee, where we promise you will gain at least 500 IO score while using our guides. So after this update, visit the links below for an exclusive discount code to sign up for skillcap.com today.